How do you feel about what is happening in the Ukraine now?
The war in Ukraine has been very personal for me. I have family back home, and one of the major battles of today was happening in what's essentially their backyard. My family members were sending me videos of explosions and helicopters. And it was really surreal. In one video, it's a backyard that I know really well where, tomatoes grow and we gather to grill meat and meet as a family. And overhead were attack helicopters. So every day has been more difficult than the last, and this day has been particularly difficult. But we're doing our best to endure. Everybody's okay. We knew this was coming. And although it is incredibly difficult, this is not a new war. And so we're braced for what comes next.
It seems like Putin is using many of the same tactics that he used in 2014. Like you said, this isn't new. I guess, can you give us the background? Like, how could the world not have seen this coming to prevent it, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah, I think that's the question of the day, because in the lead up to this, we heard a lot of narratives for justification for troop movement to Ukraine, right? All of those narratives ending up being disinformation and propaganda. And those narratives have been Ukraine is threatening Russia, NATO is threatening Russia, Ukraine is perpetuating genocide, Ukraine is perpetuating terror attacks, Ukraine is perpetuating chemical attacks, Russians need protection within Ukraine. None of those narratives are accurate. And we know that. We know that because the field of online investigations, of documenting the battles on the front line has developed significantly over the last 8 years. And it's really 8 years ago that we need to look to understand this conflict. Because in 2014, as the world will probably remember, Ukraine fought for its independence. Kiev was on fire. Snipers shot at protesters. And in the millions, Ukrainians all over the country rallied against Russian oppression. They won, but in response, Putin annexed Crimea using disinformation as a weapon, one of his weapons, and occupied the eastern territories of Luhansk and Donetsk, where the front line has largely been for the last 8 years. And it's really quite important to look at the war in that context, because the birthplace of this war is Ukrainians asking for freedom, and not any of these disinformation narratives, propaganda narratives that we see coming out of Russia and coming out of Russian governments and Russian officials.
So you actually know firsthand the impact of disinformation, of meta-narratives that are seeded. I mean, you've done so much work on this, Jane, yourself. I mean, what role is disinformation playing now, not just in the Ukraine, but its ripple effects globally?
Well, I think the one thing that disinformation is doing right now is it's capitalizing on the knowledge gap of international audiences. Because although the revolution captured the world's attention, the Crimean annexation captured the world's attention, and the downing of MH17, unfortunately, captured the world's attention. The war since then has faded to the background, and I would go so far as to say out of mind for the vast majority of the international community as they dealt with other crises that have rose up over the last 8 years. And as a result, they unlearned what they've learned in 2014. And the knowledge gap means that Russia has a big opportunity to spread the narrative that is most beneficial to them. And that narrative is a disinformation-based narrative. And there are a few different things that we see going on from the disinformation front. One very important thing is that Putin himself spread disinformation in his speech earlier this week by distorting beyond recognition Ukrainians' history. The men said that Lenin invented Ukraine, which, you only need the most basic understanding of history to understand how ridiculous that claim is. But at the same time, on social media channels, across social media channels, be it Telegram, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, there's really no social media channel that's been untouched by a disinformation narrative. We saw more and more intense mischaracterization of what was happening on the front line. And that mischaracterization ranged from false flag videos to videos from so-called leaders of these so-called republics making announcements that were pre-recorded, to attacks that were taken out of context, that once they were dissected, clearly came from the Russia side of the front line. And all of those narratives came together when Putin held a Security Council meeting where he called on his ministers to ask whether Russia should recognize the independence of these so-called republics. And so-called is quite important because these republics are under Russian occupation and they are governed by Russian puppet governments. And in the justification of their recommendations for this recognition of independence of these areas, we heard a repetition of the same disinformation narratives that were seeded online and were previously spread by Russian officials. So the justification for this war, as was the justification for annexation of Crimea and the occupation of these territories in the first place, came from disinformation narratives. And the difficult part of disinformation during a war is that every attack and every action has a different disinformation narrative behind it. So that means if Russian troops are taking over an airport, Russian side is working proactively to make it look like they were much more successful than they actually are. And that is happening with attacks all over Ukraine. Ukraine is an extremely large country by European standards. And that is causing a lot of confusion. And I realize that this is a very roundabout way of answering your question, which is how has this personally affected me? But the way this has personally affected me is that one of the major attacks today was very, very close to where my loved ones live. And I was not sure which information I could or could not rely on beyond what they were telling me from their safe spaces and the information that authorities was putting out, which is quite delayed because it takes some time to understand what's happening on the ground in the middle of a life or death situation.
It seems to me, though, that this is, I'll ask you about 2014 to today, right? So, yes, it is life or death, but it's been life or death um, in other parts of the world where disinformation has killed people, right? I'm sorry to, I shouldn't, I was
Of
thinking
course.
ahead, right? But in terms of 2014, when there was a fake account that essentially seeded the narrative that was said by the foreign minister Lavrov at the UN the next day. You know, we all remember this. Hasn't haven't the social networks or hasn't society learned to handle this? Like, why is this still being allowed to go on? I know some of the answers to that, but Jane, you've done so much work on this. How can this, why hasn't it been stopped? Why is it continuing with impunity?
This is a really difficult and really complex question because had social media companies learned from the onslaught of disinformation in 2014 about Crimea, about Eastern Ukraine, and about the downing of MH17, a horrible tragedy that has left its mark on families to this day, of course. Um, they could have adjusted their approach to how they govern the information environment and prevented or at least made less severe the disinformation attacks that we've seen all over the globe. And you are right to point out that this is happening all over the globe, because even though we've known about this problem for a very long time, and I specifically want to note that we've known about this problem before the 2016 election when the Western English speaking world realized it was a problem. There has been very little action. To this day, we can spare, I can't think of a single country to point on the map that has not dealt with a problem of disinformation, not one. And that problem inflames divisions within society that make that make our conversation seem irreconcilable, but also that promotes violence, that promotes harm, and sometimes facilitates death. Um, and so the question of why nothing was done is a really good one. And I think it's one for the social technology companies to answer, because only they can understand the timeline of when they knew what and also how they failed.
Do you see any actions being taken now that war has broken out by these companies to help cut down disinformation?
There have been some removals of fake accounts, although there's also been some false positives that saw the online investigation community with its eye on Ukraine face mass suspensions from Twitter. But I think it's quite important to remember that Facebook particularly, which in Ukraine is a really important social media network. It's treated kind of like a blog. And most official information that we see coming out starts on Facebook. But Facebook has, over the last couple of years, moved to shut down the ability to research what's happening on its platform. So it's shut down access to data. It's shut down access to data tools, particularly CrowdTangle, which was used by investigators all over the world. And it's become much harder to investigate what's going on these social media networks. And so the type of upheaval that we need to see would include proactive moderation, but also vast access to the data on these platforms to academics, journalists, researchers, and civil society globally, not just in the English-speaking world, but everywhere, so that we can actually understand what is happening on these platforms.
On a big picture, Where do you think this will lead?
I wish I knew. I wish I had an answer to that.
How will Ukrainians handle, how will your family handle this, on a day-to-day basis now as we move forward, as the world reacts?
We're in the very early stages of this escalation. And we actually don't even really know how the world is reacting. We know that regular people largely stand with Ukraine. I've never seen anything like what I'm seeing online right now. Support, including financial support and political support, is pouring in from all countries and all corners of the world and all sides. But at the same time, in contrast, most politicians have been squeamish about even just imposing sanctions on a country that is bombing peaceful cities. And that squeamishness is enabling Putin. And so I wish I could tell you, in response to your question, that the global political community has understood the gravity of this situation, but many of them seem to be paralyzed at a time when action is needed. And also at a time when their citizens, their constituents, their people are telling them that action is needed. So I don't know what happens next, but I know that Ukrainians have something to fight for, and Ukraine is certainly not lost. I can tell you that the solidarity across the country, the determination to fight back across the country is an endless pool, and that the international solidarity is already there. Whether political actions will match that, unfortunately, remains an open question.
So Jane, what is Putin after? I mean, we hear everything from like he's crazy to he's sick to he just wants to unite Russia. What is happening with him?
Look, he helped shut down the revolution in Belarus. He contributed to opening live fire on protesters in Kazakhstan. He poisoned his only opposition with a radioactive poison on Russia's own land. He he designated every free media outlet in Russia a foreign agent, and also non-government organizations, foreign agents. And then he escalated the war in Ukraine. And when you put all of that together, I think the answer is not what he wants, but what he doesn't want, which is democracy, people power, revolution, and the cultural flourishment of the region that he wants to rule over.
My last question is kind of related to that, right? The impact of disinformation, the impact of the false narratives, which Ukrainians know, but is, as you pointed out, really it's the gap that's being exploited, which then leads to doubt, which then leads to delays. This is happening as the Philippines is celebrating our 36th anniversary of people power, that people power revolt that helped spark democracy movements all around the world. And in our case, 36 years later, the son of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., is now the front runner for president. So I just woke up thinking our history, we don't seem to be learning from history. And I guess what the role is of this tainting of the corruption of our information ecosystem. I'd love your thoughts because you've done so much work on this, and you like me are now living through all of this personally. How do you put this together?
It's difficult to give a bird's eye view when you're on the ground. And it's difficult to understand what's happening while it's still happening. But what has been going on over the last 8 years in Ukraine, um, and not just in Ukraine, but globally, is a battle for how we build our nations. And disinformation has been a weapon of those who don't want to build free nations. I think that's quite important. And the only answer to that is accurate information, is people power, is democracy. And I think that's the moment we find ourselves in today.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. I mean, I hope for better days for you and your family and your nation.
Thank you. You're not alone in that hope.